Our keynote this morning, entitled What Trends We're Seeing, a New Pope, a New Way of Being Church, and Disruption in Faith Formation, will be delivered to us by Ashley McKinless and Zach Davis. Ashley McKinless, and Zach are the co-hosts of a weekly podcast, Jesuitical, where they speak with bishops and lay leaders, theologians, people in the pews, about Catholic news and stories that impact our lives. Jesuitical is a service of America Magazine, where Ashley is an executive director, Zach is an editor and director of digital strategy. So in this session, they'll be discussing, first of all, what trends they're seeing, and they'll help us explore for ourselves the trends that we are seeing. So let's have a warm welcome for Ashley and Zach.
All right, good afternoon. Thanks so much, everyone, for welcoming us. Thank you to the NCCL. Thank you to all of you for joining us in sunny Baltimore this weekend. Prayers for all of you as you gather in fellowship and community. I hope that this talk, one, doesn't put you to sleep, but also gives you just some fodder that you can take back as you discuss and discern in how to best live out your own ministry. Really quickly, my name, just so you know who you're listening to. I'm Zach. I'm our director of digital strategy and an associate editor at America. I attended Loyola University Chicago, which I'm a proud alum, and very proud to say I did know Sister Jean. She's a great friend of mine. May she rest in peace. Struck down in her prime. She recently passed away at 106. I grew up in Delaware, Ohio. In addition to hosting Jesuitical, I write on faith, culture, sports, wine, and the Catholic Church in China. This is what I've been seeing and hearing lately. I have a 3-month-old. Her name's Madeline. And this is mostly to solicit some sympathy because my brain chemistry is different now. I'm dumber than I used to be, but I hope not to disappoint you too much.
All right. Hard to follow Madeline. I'm Ashley McKinless. In addition to co-hosting Jesuitical, I'm an executive editor at America, where I run our assignments desk. So that's looking at the news of the day, assigning different pieces to respond to it, and making sure they get published in a timely manner. I grew up in Arlington, Virginia, and went to the University of Virginia. I'm also a proud alum, so wahoo wah. And while I actually prefer editing to writing, I have had the chance at America to report from diverse places like Central America, rural Colorado, and Chicago.
So what is Jesuitical? It's, first of all, it was a term that was sort of used to accuse people of thinking or talking in sort of a sly, underhanded way. Because that's what they assumed Jesuits did or thought Jesuits did. I don't think they're wrong. But we work with Jesuits. We're not Jesuits ourselves. And so that was kind of our way of saying Jesuit-ish. We started this podcast in 2017. And we podcasted daily from the conclave that elected Pope Leo XIV in Rome. We covered both sessions of the Synod on Synodality in Rome. And we've done over 300 interviews now with cardinals and bishops, lay leaders, comedians, actors, professors, other people. According to the Hawaii Catholic Herald, we have global reach. And according to my sister, she'd listen more if you talked about Taylor Swift.
All right, so I'll quickly go through the 3 segments of the show. We have Catholic news, interviews, and faith sharing. So in the Catholic news section, which we call Signs of the Times, which comes from the Vatican II document that encouraged us to, not let our Catholic faith be something we just do on Sundays, but see what's happening in the world around us and respond. So we cover everything from the very serious, the latest Vatican and Pope Leo news, the less serious Pope Leo news, like him loving this horse that he was gifted.
I've never seen him happier than when he got this horse.
But we try to do a mix of the serious and the quirky, so anything that's happening in parish life that we find entertaining or inspiring. Then, as Zach mentioned, we have conversations with people from cardinals and bishops and women religious to people, ordinary Catholics who are working in fields as diverse as law and healthcare or music or migrant ministry, and try to gain insights from the way that they live their faith in everyday life. And then finally, we have some faith sharing. We call this "as one friend speaks to another," which is a wordy phrase, but it comes from St. Ignatius, and we draw on Ignatian spirituality with the help of our Jesuit colleagues to kind of mine our weeks and see where God was working.
That's all right. So we're going to be talking about 5 trends. We were given sort of a pretty broad invitation to mandate, which is perfect because I love to pontificate. So these are just 5 things that have been coming up in our conversations on our show and with church leaders, things that we're noticing and seeing. One, we're going to talk about if there is a religious revival happening in the country right now. 2, examine why we're constantly talking past each other in the culture wars and some of the church's more neuralgic issues. 3, we're going to make the case that immigration is emerging as the church's most important political issue today. 4, synodality is here to stay. If you don't know what that is, we're going to try to explain it and talk about where it's been and where it's going. And finally, we're going to talk about how the church's digital mission is changing, and we don't exactly know how yet.
All right. Are we in the midst of a religious revival? You've probably seen headlines declaring it, celebratory headlines in both secular and Christian outlets saying that young people are going back to church. But once you get past the triumphant headlines, the picture gets a little murkier. Are people really flocking back to church, or are we just excited to believe they are? When we talk about the religious revival, 3 groups jump out: Gen Z in general, young men in particular, and trad Caths, or Catholics attracted to more traditional liturgies and devotions. So I'm going to look at each in turn to see if the data backs up this vibe shift we're going through. So first, Gen Z. These are people born between 1997 and 2012, so they're now between 13 and 28 years old. And how do they stack up against previous generations? Well, at first glance, they are the least religious, both in terms of belief and behavior. Pew Research finds that 40% believe in God without a doubt, compared with 48% of millennials and 57% of boomers. 38% never go to church, compared to 31% of millennials and 25% of boomers. But those data points don't tell the whole story. Barna Group, which is a respected Christian research firm, found that for the first time, young Christians are on average going to church more frequently than older Christians. So among the youngest cohort, they're going to church 1.9 times per month, or 23 services per year. And that's compared to a national average of 1.6 times per month. So the youngest Christians are actually showing up for church services more than even the boomers or Gen X or millennials. And a report released just last week from the Leadership Roundtable found that Catholics in particular, between the age 18 and 29 are, quote, more likely than any other age group to attend Mass daily, weekly, or monthly, are far more likely to engage in parish activities beyond Mass, and are more likely to go to confession, to engage in Eucharistic adoration, to attend social events, and more, end quote. So that's a really significant finding that we just got last week. A Harvard study found that there was a 6% rise in Zoomers identifying as Catholic between 2022 and 2023. And a lot of this has been happening since the pandemic. In 2020, all religious attendance was hitting lows, but there's been this surprising rebound, especially among young people. And then zooming out, I think the biggest story in religion in the United States in general right now is that the decades-long march and rise of the nones, those who identify with no religion, has actually leveled off. So you've probably seen those headlines that since the 70s, or in the 70s, there were only 5% of Americans who identified as a nun, and that just steadily kept going up until it reached around 30% in 2022. And before Gen Z, every generation was significantly less religious than the one before it. but Gen Z looks pretty similar to millennials. And so a plateau is not the same thing as a revival, but after years of kind of depressing headlines about churches hemorrhaging believers, I think it can feel like one. So what might account for Gen Z's surprising religiosity? I would point to a couple of factors. For one, Zoomers were raised by parents who were themselves not very religious. So these young people can see converting as an act of rebellion or a way of forming their own distinct identity from their parents. The religion researcher Ryan Burge, whose website Graphs About Religion I highly recommend and relied on a lot for this topic, summarized it well. He said, "To be a young person is to rebel against your parents. In my generation, it was like, oh, I grew up very hardcore Catholic or evangelical, and so I became an atheist. That was the most rebellious thing you can do. But imagine if you are a second generation atheist or third generation atheist. You know what the most rebellious thing you can do? It's to be Orthodox Christian or be Catholic." And even if people aren't rebelling per se, these are young people who don't have the baggage that can come with a religious upbringing that might have had some unhappy church experiences. They have no memory of sitting through long, boring masses when they were a teenager, and there was no proverbial strict nun with a ruler that terrorized them in school. So they don't come to church with these preconceived notions of what it is. On Jesuitical last year, Zach and I spoke to a mother and son they kind of showed this dynamic. Helene had been raised in a very Catholic household and then basically left the church after 2002 and the sex abuse crisis. She had her 2 kids baptized, but they didn't really receive a religious upbringing at all. And then she was shocked to find that now in their early 20s, both her son and daughter are going back to church without her. Her son, Dean, told us that he knew his mom was disillusioned about the Catholic Church and its many sins, but he just didn't have that same hostility. So when he walked into a beautiful mass one Sunday, kind of on a whim, he found a beautiful refuge, some silence, and moral grounding in a very, what he saw as shallow, consumeristic, capitalistic world, and the church was something that was set apart from that. And Dean isn't unique, which brings us to the next big storyline of the religious revival, which is young men. Is it?
Just hit space.
Oh, okay. There we go. All right. For as long as we've had statistics or eyes to see, we've known that women tend to be more religious than men. Look at any parish and you see an army of female volunteers keeping the lights on and the flowers fresh. And across generations and religions and cultures, studies have consistently found higher religiosity among women. And then for the first time in 2019, something remarkable happened in the United States. For the first time, women born after 1980 became more likely than men to never attend religious services. Among 18 to 40-year-olds, 18% of men are Catholic compared to 16% of women. Among that same cohort, the percentage of women who identified with no religion is 3% higher than men, 30 to 27%. It's a small gap, but it reverses a centuries-old trend. So what might account for this historic reversal? Like so many things in our country today, politics and polarization might be part of the answer. Young men are becoming much more conservative at the same time that young women are moving to the left. For these young, conservative, often white men, Christianity is one of the few institutions that they see standing up for traditional family values and isn't preaching that about the dangers of toxic masculinity. And for liberal women who grew up in the age of Me Too, #MeToo, which became #ChurchToo, and the striking down of nationwide abortion rights in 2022, the church may be seen as working against their interests. In this reading of the trend, the church is right-coded, just another part of the manosphere, and men are embracing religion in the same way they embrace Joe Rogan. And that might be part of the story, but looking at where young men are today, they're falling behind women in terms of education and employment. Instead of purpose, the world offers them endless pornography, video games, and sports gambling. sports gambling. And I think a lot of them are coming away hungry for something more. So they're searching for community, for meaning in a fragmented world. And the church has always been a place for such lost sheep. All right. And finally, the trad cats. Are they the future of the church in the United States? From the coverage they receive in the media, it sure seems like it. Since Pope Francis's decision to restrict the celebration of the traditional Latin Mass in 2021, fans of the pre-Vatican II liturgy have argued that the Pope was clamping down on one of the most vibrant parts of the Catholic Church. We hear stories of Latin Masses packed with large young families and Catholics driving hours to attend what they consider to be more reverent liturgies. And that intensely devoted community certainly does exist. But the fact is, they remain a tiny minority. Only 2% of U.S. Catholics attend a traditional Latin Mass weekly, and only 13% of U.S. Catholics say they have attended one in at least 5 years. But still, interest in the Latin Mass has steadily increased since St. John Paul II liberalized its celebration in the late 80s. And much of that interest is among young people who have no personal experience of the old liturgy. And even young people who don't seek out the Latin Mass are attracted to more traditional devotions, like veiling, Eucharistic adoration, or kneeling to receive the Eucharist. Data on such practices is hard to come by, but there are anecdotes to back it up. On Jesuitical, we spoke to a woman, Madeline Kearns, who wrote a story about women veiling at Mass, and she spoke to someone who produces these veils, and she said in the last 10 years she's seen her sales skyrocket. We've also heard stories of tensions at churches attached to college campuses, where the more traditional preferences of students often clash with the more Vatican II sensibility of the local population. So today, devotees of the Latin Mass are waiting to see if our new American Pope, Leo, will listen to their pleas and loosen restrictions on the celebration of the old liturgy. Whatever he decides will be deeply important to a small minority of the U.S. Catholic Church, but it's unlikely to help or hinder whatever religious revival is underway. So, in conclusion, has the religious revival been overhyped? Probably. But something is stirring in the faith lives of the younger generation, and the church should be paying attention. Gen Z is the least religious generation on record. But ironically, because so many of them have no experience of church, they are more likely to give it a chance. That's not a full-blown revival, but it's fertile ground for one.
It's a good segue, because I'm going to talk about culture wars and why we keep talking past each other on things like the Latin Mass. It's a bit more meta, but I've been noticing in almost every debate about the church in the world, it sort of centers around how we should interact with each other. Should the church fight climate change? Should our liturgy look more familiar to someone walking in from the street in 2025 or 1525? Should church teaching influence our politics and our politicians, or should they remain radically separate? Is the church behind the times and needs to catch up, or should Christians stay away from the times? It's not really about any one of these issues. It's more about competing visions of the church's relationship to culture. I think about this book all the time. I read it in college when I was at Loyola Chicago. It's by a 20th century Protestant theologian, H. Richard Niebuhr, not to be confused with Reinhold Niebuhr. And Niebuhr, it's a remarkable little book. I think it's still in print. This one is a very old copy. But what he does in this is he comes up with sort of 5 typologies for understanding how Christians or the church should relate to culture. This is sort of the way that Niebuhr describes the problem. In his single-minded direction towards God, Christ leads men away from the temporality and pluralism of culture. Yet, the Son of God is himself a child of a religious culture and sends his disciples to tend his lambs and sheep who cannot be guarded without cultural work, right? So this is sort of the main problem, right? We are called to be in the world, but also a part of it in some ways. And he gives sort of 5 responses to this problem, and I'll just quickly give an overview of them. The first is Christ against culture. This model emphasizes the radicalness of Christianity and the otherness of it to culture. Jesus asks us to make either or choices here, right? The gate's narrow. You should probably sell all your possessions and start a monastery in the desert, which is what many early Christians did. Christ of or in culture, Christ was born into and lived in a culture, a Jewish culture in ancient Palestine. And he was certainly an eccentric in that culture, but he didn't fully repudiate his background either. And efforts to erase Jesus' Jewish identity have contributed to anti-Semitism in the church's history. Moreover, if culture is human achievement and we are created in the image of God, then surely you can find a good amount of agreement between Christ and culture. I tend to think that the Jesuit spirituality of finding God in all things fits most at home here. Christ above culture. Christ is not really in or against culture, but he's in a separate sphere entirely. It's similar to Christ in culture in that it doesn't view culture as totally evil and to be avoided. And it's similar to Christ against culture because it holds that there is still a chasm between culture and God. Sort of holds that culture can lead humans to God, but in the end, we're going to have to make a choice or a leap of faith. For Christ and culture and paradox, this holds that Christ and culture are radically opposed, so it's very similar to Christ against culture here. But this position usually holds that you have to sort of follow both Christ and culture nonetheless. So you sort of live your life in this total tension, trying to live as a tortured dual citizen, right? I think a lot of people have experiences of feeling like they, when your family is still your family, whether that's your culture or your church, and as much as you might disagree with things, you are still usually a member of one of those. And finally, there is Christ transforming culture. In this model, Christ and culture are still opposed, but it holds that Christ exists in culture to the extent that he's transforming it. There's this old G.K. Chesterton quote that's, we don't want a church that will move with the world, we want a church that will move the world. The world might have fallen, but it's in a process of conversion, and you run into different stages of that conversion in different encounters with culture. Now, I'm not here to say which one of these is correct, and that's not really Niebuhr's goal either. And you'll find that most Christians, even St. Paul, find themselves at different points on this spectrum throughout their lives, depending on the situation. And I actually think these are pretty good typologies, and they really don't need updated. And these are still the same arguments that we're having all the time, sort of where we're at, what kind of type we're applying to a given question. But I did want to suggest if there are models for the Catholic Church today that sound a bit more contemporary. So maybe the church is my culture, or my cultural background. This might be someone who says, I was raised Catholic, but, and how many times if you've told someone that you work for the church, that's sort of the next thing that comes out of their mouth. And with that, you don't really know what that means, but it implies that they have some experience for what you do, but maybe there's some baggage there that you need to tap into and be sensitive to. The church is a fortress against culture. I think this comes up a lot when you hear people talk about like defending the faith or guarding the faith, or I think sometimes apologetics can get into this. Like it's a fortress against culture. You can come here to hide or be safe. I think a lot of people find safety because, let's be honest, there are a lot of bad things in the culture, and the church does provide a safe haven. The church cannot speak to culture. You might say that the church has sort of lost its credibility, its moral credibility, its ability to speak because of scandal or because it has not kept up with the means of communication, to hint ahead a little bit later. The church is behind culture and it needs to catch up, or the church should be everyone's culture. I think some people think that is the way things should go. So what? I think this is important because evangelization doesn't happen in a vacuum. It happens in culture. And so often when we're discussing issues that really matter in the church or in people's lives, we're speaking past each other because we haven't asked about or articulated sort of what our definitions are and what our models of the church are. What do I have? What does my interlocutor have? And how might we reach some common ground there?
Okay. Speaking of issues that are important in people's lives, I think today the story of President Donald Trump's sweeping mass deportation campaign is not only one of the most important stories in the country, but for the U.S. Church. For Catholics, defending migrants is not just a political issue. We all know that Scripture commands us again and again to welcome the stranger. And for American Catholics, migrants are not a stranger at all. They are our parishioners, our neighbors, our family members, and our friends. According to the one part of the body report, 61% of migrants at risk for deportation are Catholic. 18% of U.S. Catholics overall are themselves vulnerable to deportation or live with someone who is. So this is very much not an abstract issue for the church. Despite the fact that the majority of people at risk for deportation are Catholic, U.S. Catholic citizens themselves are conflicted on the issue. According to Pew, only 30% of Catholics say that caring for immigrants is essential to being Catholic, and more Catholics say that a growing immigrant population is a change for the worse than say it's a change for the better. And of course, we know that in 2024, 55% of Catholics voted for President Trump, who one of the main pillars of his campaign was carrying out the largest mass deportation campaign in US history. And Trump has followed through on that promise. The Catholic world, thankfully, is responding, starting at the very top. So I want to talk a little bit about what Pope Leo has done so far. When he was elected, many Catholics wondered, would the first American Pope insert himself into US politics? His predecessor, Pope Francis, did not refrain from weighing in. On the eve of President Trump's second inauguration, the late Jesuit Pope was asked about the president's deportation plans and said such a campaign would be a disgrace. A month later, Pope Francis made an unprecedented intervention when he sent a strongly worded letter to all bishops in the United States, calling on them to stand against mass deportations. 6 months into Leo's papacy, it's clear he wants the same thing. In his first major interview, he referenced that letter from Pope Francis, saying he was very happy to see some bishops take it up. And he tellingly acknowledged that because he is an American, people here cannot dismiss him as they sometimes did under Francis, arguing that the Argentine Pope didn't understand US politics. In September, Leo weighed in on the controversy surrounding Cardinal Blaise Cupich and his decision to award a pro-choice Democratic senator a Lifetime Achievement Award for his work on immigration. He said, quote, "Someone who says I'm against abortion, but I am in agreement with the inhumane treatment of immigrants in the United States. I don't know if that's pro-life." Earlier this month, Leo was asked about Catholics being denied entry to a migrant processing center to deliver communion. Speaking to reporters in English, so he could be heard here, Leo defended the spiritual rights of detainees and encouraged ICE authorities to allow the sacraments to be distributed in detention centers. Finally, in October, Pope Leo met with a delegation led by El Paso's Bishop Mark Seitz, who brought letters from undocumented people in the United States. In the meeting, Leo said the church could not remain silent, and of the bishop said, quote, "I wish they were stronger in their own voice," according to Bishop Seitz. So clearly, Pope Leo is paying attention to what is happening to migrants in the United States, and he wants the church to stand up to the Trump administration. So how is the US church fighting back? I want to highlight 3 ways: advocacy, accompaniment, and the courts. Since Trump's inauguration, the Bishops' Conference has issued at least 8 formal statements related to migration, including a highly significant one just yesterday that I'll return to. The individual bishops have not shied away from denouncing the mass deportation campaign in the strongest possible terms. Cardinal Robert McElroy of Washington, D.C., called the deportation campaign inhumane and morally repugnant. Bishop Seitz has called mass deportations a moral crisis in my diocese and a deeply social crisis. But statements are not enough. That was the message Bishop Seitz, who heads up the USCCB's Migration Committee, delivered to his brothers at the Bishops' Fall meeting in Baltimore this week. Zach and I were able to attend the public sessions of that meeting, and Seitz's address was by far the most forceful and urgent of the day. Calling out the Trump administration by name, he denounced, quote, "intimidating and dehumanizing tactics, false rhetoric painting immigrants as terrorists and criminals, and threats to religious liberty." Quote, "As pastors devoted to the gospel of Jesus Christ, we know statements alone are not enough." To that end, he announced a new initiative called You Are Not Alone that will focus on new and expanded efforts in 4 areas: emergency and family support, accompaniment and pastoral care, communication and church teaching, and solidarity through prayer and public witness. But of course, the people of God in the United States did not need to wait for the bishops to start doing that work. Across the country, Catholics have been standing with immigrants in creative ways. In Chicago, where President Trump's Operation Midway Blitz has terrorized the immigrant community and led to some violent clashes between masked ICE agents and protesters, Catholics have responded with prayer and public witness. Twice in October, Catholics celebrated Mass and processed to an ICE detention center, seeking to distribute communion to detainees. Both times they were turned away. But that doesn't mean their efforts were in vain. On one of these occasions, the group continued praying and singing Pan de Vida outside the detention site. A Jesuit who was there said, "I'm sure they heard us singing. I'm sure they heard us talking. So hopefully they get strength from our presence." Catholics have also been a presence at courthouses, where unsuspecting migrants have been snatched up by ICE when they show up for routine asylum check-ins. In June, Bishop Michael Pham of San Diego, who was born in Vietnam and came to the United States as a refugee, led a delegation of clergy to the immigration courts. Simply their presence in the building led ICE agents to scatter. Finally, Catholic bishops, priests, and sisters have sought to challenge the Trump administration in the courts. They've launched 4 lawsuits this year relating to the inhumane treatment of migrants in detention, visas for religious workers, and funding for the church's refugee resettlement work. Taken together, I would argue that immigration has become the defining political issue for the US Church today. For decades, fairly or not, the Church was primarily known for its advocacy for the unborn. Its message was simple: overturn Roe v. Wade. In 2022, that campaign succeeded, returning abortion law to the states. And while defending the unborn remains the preeminent priority for the US bishops when it comes to voting, and while the Church's tireless efforts to support mothers and defend the right to life continue, they've struggled to find a clear and unifying message in the post-Roe Trump 2.0 world. The same cannot be said for migration. Yesterday, for the first time in 12 years, the US bishops released a special pastoral message on the situation of migrants. The last time this type of statement, which requires the approval of a supermajority of the bishops, was made was in 2013 in response to the Affordable Care Act's contraceptive mandate. In yesterday's message, the bishops said they were saddened by the vilification of immigrants and opposed the campaign of indiscriminate mass deportation. The statement passed with 216 votes in favor, 5 against, and 3 abstentions, and was met with a standing ovation. One archbishop told reporters that it's not easy to get all the bishops moving in the same direction, but that the overwhelming support for the message showed a, quote, fundamental unity amongst us. So the bishops are speaking together with moral clarity and acting as one in opposition to the unprecedented nationwide crackdown on our migrant neighbors. I want to do a brief update on where Synodality is. I know later this week you're going to be hearing from Sister Natalie Bicart, who's the real expert on Synodality, so I'll keep this relatively brief. First, a quick refresher on what happened at the Synod on Synodality. There we go. So Zach and I went to Rome to cover the Synod, both in October of 2023 and October of 2024, which was a great experience. And we worked really hard. Zach does his best work horizontally.
It's true. The laptop is open there. The eyes are not. That was pre-kid too. Not great.
Okay. So when Pope Francis first called for a synod on synodality in 2021, there you go. There we go. I, like many Catholics, found the concept a bit confusing. What is this? A meeting about meetings? Synodality is not a word that most English speakers have encountered, And it was hard to find a consistent definition. This was one of America's most popular articles in those early stages. So if you can't explain it to a 12-year-old, you need to try harder. And today there's still no single definition of synodality. It's a church that's walking together, a listening church. Pope Leo said it's an attitude, an openness, a willingness to understand. And so because synodality is really a new way of being church, I think it needs to be experienced on some level to be understood. So here's what we've experienced over the past 4 years. So the process began with listening sessions at the diocesan level, at which all Catholics were encouraged to share their hopes and challenges with the Catholic Church. Those responses were synthesized at the national and continental levels and then discussed at global assemblies in Rome in 2023 and 2024. And for the first time in modern history, the Synod of Bishops included women and lay people, not only as participants in the room, but who could vote on the final document. And that final document was signed by Pope Francis after the second meeting in 2024, making it an official part of the magisterium. So what are some of the major takeaways of the final document? First is that synodality is now a constitutive dimension of the life of the church. It is not a tool we can occasionally take out of the drawer, but an integral to the church's identity. The text also emphasizes the need for the participation of all the baptized in decision-making and greater leadership roles for women. Between the two meetings in Rome, a number of controversial issues, including women deacons and the role of bishops, were removed from the purview of the synod body and relegated to study groups for deeper consideration. Final reports from those groups have not yet been published, but we're expecting them in the coming months. And so where we are now, we're in the implementation phase of the synod, which will continue until the end of the year. Then 2027 is the evaluation phase, which begins in order to prepare evaluations for the synod's implementation ahead of the 2028 assembly in Rome. So the meetings continue all the way up until 2028. And now I want to talk a bit about the synod's reception in the United States. Yeah. Yes. So I would say the reception of synodality in the US has ranged from enthusiastic to indifferent to hostile. The local listening sessions that took place in 2021 and 2022 were the largest consultation in the history of the church and really any institutions. Millions of Catholics were able to voice their concerns for the first time and really be heard. Still, in the US, only 1% of Catholics took part in a listening session. So it's a pretty small part of the church. So to succeed, synodality does need buy-in on the ground level, and many Catholics found that either their bishop or their pastor did not invest that much in the process. One of the most common questions Zach and I get about the synod has been, what do I do if my parish has done nothing for the synod? And to be fair, the lack of buy-in in some churches is not always due to hostility toward synodality per se. In dioceses across the US, bishops are dealing with bankruptcy, parish closures, and burnt-out priests. The synod process is a heavy lift, and dioceses were given limited time and resources to implement it. But there was also a small but very vocal opposition to the synod, led by US Cardinal Raymond Burke, and bolstered by parts of the Catholic media. The cardinal warned that the synod is a Trojan horse that will lead to changes in Catholic doctrine on questions of morality and sexuality, and could even lead to schism. In the end, no such doctrinal changes came out of the synod, allaying the concerns of some critics, but disappointing Catholics who had hoped for more concrete pronouncements on issues like married priests, women deacons, and ministry to LGBT Catholics. So next, what can we expect for synodality under Pope Leo? Pope Leo, of course, has first-hand experience of synodality. Then Cardinal Robert Prevost took part in both global meetings of the synod in Rome. And many Vatican watchers at the conclave this spring saw it as a referendum on Pope Francis and his signature project, synodality. From his very first words as Pope, Leo has indicated that synodality is here to stay. Speaking from the balcony overlooking St. Peter's Square, the newly elected Pope said unequivocally, quote, "We want to be a synodal church, a church that walks, a church that always seeks peace, that always seeks charity, that always seeks to be close, especially to those who suffer." And since then, Leo has allowed the synod process to proceed unencumbered. That said, synodality will probably look different under Pope Leo because he's a different person than Francis with a different style, and we're at a different part of the synodal process. Leo has also stressed the importance of unity, so it's possible that he will be more attentive to the fears and concerns of the synod's critics. In October, at the Jubilee of Synodal Teams in Rome, Leo acknowledged that we all don't run in the same speed, and sometimes we have to be patient with one another or risk a rift in the ecclesial experience. But he also said, quote, "Let us commit ourselves to building a church that is entirely synodal, ministerial, and attracted to Christ, and therefore committed to serving the world." So while it might have a different flavor under Pope Leo, it is safe to say that synodality is here to stay.
So as I mentioned earlier, in addition to hosting the podcast, my job at America is I'm our director of digital strategy. So I think a lot about the internet and how we exist on there, where it's going, and the best way to sell you subscriptions to America Magazine. By the way,
QR code to come.
americamagazine.org/subscribe. I don't think this is news to you that faith formation outside of the parish and sort of online has exploded in the past few years between the Hallow app, programs like Exodus 90, Chosen, Carlo Acutis. I mean, like, it's all over the place. Does this sound familiar to you in your roles? Yes. But before we begin, I want to make a couple observations that'll hopefully shake us out of the way that we normally think about the church's digital mission. First, what is the internet? Is it a place where we share information about what we do in real life? Is it a platform like a road or a bridge, or does it take us somewhere? Or is it a place on its own terms with its own culture and language? Note during the synod, one of the processes to get from the local level up to the universal church in Rome, it went through a national phase and then a continental phase. So in addition to North America and Africa and Asia, one of the continents was the digital mission of the church. So the church is at least starting to think about the digital culture as on its own terms. The next question I have is, why does the church or the parish still think like it's the electric company? And what I mean by that is that a lot of times we adopt this idea that we have a utility, you can't get it anywhere else, so you have to come to us for it, right? I think sort of the primary example of this is in sacraments like marriage, where the conventional wisdom was you would see young people leaving the church, but you would just say, oh, they'll come back when it's time to get married, right? Because we have marriage here. No one else has it. I think you've probably seen in your own families and communities that that's not really true, right? And as soon as they encounter any kind of red tape at the parish level, it's like, I'm more interested in getting married under a waterfall anyway, so thanks, but no thanks. I'll see you later. Traditionally, I've used this metaphor to explain that the church is ignored, or at least not actively sought out, people who get spiritual meaning outside of institutional religion. But I think in the digital age, I think this has taken on a new meaning for me, because it also explains a little bit that Catholics who don't really need the parish anymore for their faith formation, as that content and even a community exists online. Next, I want to talk about the evolution of social media. First, starting with social media 1.0 is what I'll call it. This is a very old screenshot of Facebook. Some of you may remember. Who was on, anyone on MySpace before Facebook? I was on MySpace. Zanga? No, couple Zanga. Yep. That's where I learned HTML. But really, we'll start with Facebook. And I think in this era, it basically connected you with people you knew in real life, right? You either looked at their photos or poked them or played Farmville with them. But that was sort of the early idea of social media. And then you began able to follow companies, brands, bands, influencers. It pivoted away from your friends into following people. And with that came algorithms and For You pages and infinite scrolling and short form video. In short, this has been a shift away from relationship towards content and media. I think that this has a few implications for the church. On a parish level, the internet went from an effective tool in which to organize around to a crowded marketplace where any message or potluck invitation was drowned out. One example, like take a parish bulletin. If you handed that to someone on their way out of Mass, you probably got 80% of people reading that, right? If you handed it to them on their way into Mass, you got 100% of people because they would read it during the homily. But if a lot of places, in order to cut costs or make it more convenient, have shifted to emailing that thing. And I look at the stats every day. The average open rate on an email, like a really good one, it's like 10%. So like you might be saving paper in some other ways, but you are not connecting the way that you used to. Now your email showing up next to a promotion from McDonald's and breaking news alerts from America Magazine. Did I mention you should subscribe? The other thing this has meant, there's been a rise in Catholics consuming content that's been totally disconnected from their geographical parish and their real life relationships. Your parishioner doesn't need your pastor's homily. He can just listen to Father Mike Schmitz on the way home. So this is sort of the waterfall here. It was a social tool, now it's content, and the content is turned into a dopamine source. I want to talk a little bit about the algorithm and why I think this is a problem. Because what content you're fed by your device in your For You page, it's more and more determined by a statistical model that's meant to occupy as much of your attention as possible. These companies don't make money if you are not staring at your little screen. And nothing holds attention quite like addiction or a dopamine rush. And we know from studies and congressional hearings that what the algorithms that these companies have made prioritize things that sound more like the evil spirit than the Beatitudes. Documents show that companies prioritize showing content that's more likely to enrage us, divide us, and foment extremism. And so even a Catholic with an evangelizing mission who is taking their show online or in podcast feeds like us is going to have to grapple with the fact that algorithms don't reward what the gospel demands. I think this is worse for lay Catholics because let me paint you a picture. General decline in parish life, parish mergers, etc. There aren't exactly a lot of well-paying catechesis or youth ministry jobs for lay Catholics. So they start a blog or a podcast or a YouTube channel that begins as explainers or apologetics or generic Catholic content. They start to see some success and maybe even some money from that engagement that they're getting. But to sustain a career as an influencer, you have to always feed these algorithms. And so what are you going to put up as your next video? Is it going to be something that is leading someone to the gospel or to more and more clicks? I think this is a real temptation, and I'm not immune to it, right? But especially if you're a lay Catholic who has your livelihood on the line, I think that temptation's even greater. The algorithms don't only have an effect on the content creators, but it's breaking all of our brains, right? I don't think I have to explain much more about how our cognitive and interpersonal skills are lagging behind. I am sort of alarmed by this idea and concept of brain rot, which is essentially, we've got people just like, if you've ever walked into a casino and seen someone sort of totally disassociate at a slot machine, that's essentially what we're all doing on the subway every day. And I get it, like at the end of a long day, you do just kind of want to turn your brain off, but we used to maybe seek out other people for that, and now there's a screen and you don't have to. So there's a lot of new realities, I think, with the church's digital mission. One, faith formation is now taking place outside the parish setting. The internet's not simply a means of communication, it's mission territory. Online, hierarchies are flattened for better or worse. One example at the bishops' meeting yesterday, one bishop who I think has fallen victim to a lot of these extremism and conspiracy theories got up and sort of hijacked the agenda and made a very off-topic point and was sort of passed over in silence in the room. And if you were in the room, you noticed like, oh, that person just wanted to sort of make their point. That video of his intervention's got over 1 million views on social media right now. So hierarchies are flattened, right? So the discrepancy between what's happening in the room versus what's happening online, and I won't use the phrase what's happening in real life because our digital lives are our real lives now. All of this should change the way we think about our digital mission. The good news is that the Pope is thinking about this. And for the first time, I actually have confidence that we have a Pope who has not only had a smartphone, but been an active user of social media before. I love Pope Francis. He famously loved to call people, but I do not think he was the one sending the tweets. This Leo tweet I thought was excellent, and it came just a couple weeks ago. In recent years, many young people have approached faith through social media, successful programs, and popular online Christian witnesses. He forgot to name Jesuitical there. That's fine. The danger is that a faith discovered online is limited to individual experiences, which may be intellectually and emotionally reassuring, but never embodied. Such experience remains disembodied, detached from the ecclesial body. My only pushback here is the Pope would be that it's not just young people. We're all addicted to our devices. And so I think we have to put that narrative to bed. I think young people are more at risk because they've never had an experience of a world like without this stuff. But I mean, you all can look at your screen time reports. So in conclusion, one of my major takeaways about the church's digital mission is that we actually have a renewed in-person mission to push back on some of the effects of digital culture. When we have people in front of us, embodied, we have an obligation to present an anthropology and a vision of the good life without sounding too alarmist and like I'm against those kids and their rock and roll. I'm really worried about what technology is doing to our ways of thinking and relating to one another. But we can call upon our own tradition of the Catholic imagination and social teaching to insist that thinking is actually good, brain rot is bad, and technology isn't the cure to loneliness. People and service are. So in conclusion, we were all over the place, but this is sort of what our show is like. We're trying to look at everything happening in the world and in the church and make some sense of it. We try to have honest conversations on our show. But talking about a religious revival, is it real? Maybe not, but there's definitely something happening. Talked about the culture wars and why we're talking past each other and Richard Niebuhr's types for Christ and culture. Talked about immigration becoming the church's most important political issue, how synodality is here to stay, and how we need to come up with new ways of thinking about the church's digital mission. So I'm Zach Davis. That was Ashley McKinless. Thanks so much.